I've enjoyed comics all my life. When I was a child, the boys in the neighborhood wouldn't let me see their comic books. So I was always they were always in little groups on the porch and they wouldn't let me in because I was a girl. And so I was like, fine, I'll make my own character. So I actually did create my own superhero characters when I was a child.
I like that they're kind of slightly disreputable. I like that one artist and one artist's vision can control an entire project from beginning to end. There are amazing comics that come out on Xerox paper, and there are amazing comics that come out in fancy glossy books.
Ever since I was like a kid and I'm able to like open up like a Jim Davis book, like with Garfield the comic strips, even though I wasn't able to read, I wasn't able to get the jokes or anything, I still like was able to really enjoy the artwork too. And I feel like you're just carrying like a piece of like, it might not be fine art, but it's like you're carrying a museum with you everywhere you go.
I mean, I had a pretty good audience, but I have to clarify, I wasn't just exclusively drawing Latino things, but being a Latino who's drawing it, it's a Latino thing. I can draw a fire hydrant, it's still a Latino drew that.
What I love most about comics, the combination of words and images, and the multiple ways you can combine words and images.
Why comic books? Why are they so important? This visual and verbal media that tells stories of all ways of living, all ways of experiencing, all subjectivities. They're so important. Many of us grew up on comics. We read them as children. I know that I learned English with the help of comics when I moved from Mexico. Many creators of color remember comic books as their first literacy device, their first exposure to narrative in written and visual form. Many of us also remember those Saturday morning cartoons, comic book superheroes grabbing our attention because they were depicting, portraying, representing people that could overcome impossible seeming obstacles.
One of my first experiences with, I guess, what would become known as superheroes is something like Zorro to start with, right? Because he's kind of a proto-superhero. Probably one of the influences for Batman, some people have said, and I used to love that character.
You know, a white man wrote Zorro back in the early 1900s. It was pulp zines they used to put out in the early American history. So Zorro started in that fiction, but he got it right, you know? It was a son of a landowner in California who saw the injustices that the Spaniards were doing to the natives there, and he was also mestizo. His mother was Indian, so at night he would dress up with his father's wealth that he inherited, a la Batman, and he had his own cave, and he would write the injustices that his Spanish ancestors were doing on the natives, which pretty cool, you know, because I'm mestizo and I'm mixed of native and Spanish too, so I could really identify with the Zorro character as a hero, somebody empowered and doing something good.
I'm sure like you guys have them here, but in South America they used to produce, and same as in Italy though, by the way, like local comics about like Looney Tunes characters. So they were like super tiny and local produced. So I probably the first kind of Latin American guy I met through comics, or I read in comics, was Speedy Gonzalez. Well, when I was reading it, I didn't even care about it, you know, because I was a little kid. I was like 5 years old, you know. But yeah, you know, time passes by and you start figuring out stuff that you say, well, this is kind of like odd. Like maybe like, I know all Mexicans don't wear like this huge hat but at that moment, I never even doubted that Mexican people actually looked like that, you know.
Instead we tried to catch the Speedy Gonzalez. We should have caught Slowpoke Rodriguez, the slowest mouse in all Mexico.
Slowpoke Rodriguez? He's for me.
Wait, Jose! Jose, I got to tell you.
You look at Speedy Gonzalez, and then you look at like his cousin Slowpoke, and it's like basically saying like, because Speedy Gonzalez is basically caricature, supposed to be a caricature of like Mexican people, like the world. So like Slowpoke is like lazy, and the whole town is lazy and drunk and all that other stuff. So yeah, those kind of things. There's caricatures and stereotypes of Mexicans, basically, that, and Latino people.
Now he tells me.
When you talk about comics in the 1940s, comics were a mass medium in terms of like everyone reading them for a very short time. And then after the war, there were some ex-servicemen that read them, but a lot of people that read comics were children. And this sounds terrible, but because they were a good thing for people to read as they learned English or as they learned to read, period. So you do have, because of the disparity in education and all the communities of color, there's actually a higher than usual ratio of people reading comics in those communities than you expect in a white community. And that is something that comics then had never returned. You see some pushes in that direction from mainstream companies towards African American readers, but never really towards the Latin.
As a kid, it was the escapism. I had two very hardworking parents who worked multiple jobs, and comics and books and cartoons, of course, were sort of a combination of supplemental educational stuff, but also entertainment and a way to get out of our little apartment in Brooklyn occasionally.
A culture that I'm a part of sometimes misses the point and sometimes misses the mark. Specifically the comic I do is about a luchador. And the reason I started doing it is because every time I saw a luchador in a comic book or even in American pop culture, they kind of always got it wrong. They didn't understand what was fun and cool about lucha libre. They thought it was just the costume. They thought it was just the mask. It was a lot of like, we're adding diversity. We've got a Mexican guy. Look, there's a luchador right there. And meanwhile, he doesn't behave like a luchador. He doesn't wrestle. He doesn't do anything that would make him a luchador other than having. Literally, it's the worst case of cultural appropriation because he literally just has the mask on. So we don't even know that it's a brown guy under the mask, you know what I mean? It's just a guy in a mask. Bane, who is ostensibly a luchador, I don't think, other than the Batman 66 books that have come out recently, I don't think I've ever seen him wrestle. He just has a lucha libre mask on.
Well, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I lived in New York in a predominantly Puerto Rican neighborhood. It was a time when there were not a lot of Latino and Latinx superheroes at all, or comics. There was, in my neighborhood, and the comic that everybody loved, and that was created the same year I was born, was Black Panther. And Black Panther was, I think, for the neighborhood I grew up in, which was a very lively and wonderful neighborhood, but also, an economically challenged neighborhood. The fantasy of Black Panther, the first African superhero in comics, was a fantasy of this alternate homeland of Wakanda where they had power and wealth, and they had the ability to command respect from the rest of the world, and particularly the United States. So I think, growing up in that neighborhood, even though I myself was not Latino or African American, as part of that community, I think we all shared that identification. And I think for the Puerto Rican kids fellow comics lovers with me who grew up, that was the closest one could get.
I felt like they weren't many African American characters, like main characters. And I see that it's changing a lot, especially with Kid Flash, for example, in CW. He was Caucasian. And with the new 52, I think, reboot DC, they made him into an African American character. And I see that a lot, especially with the newer characters coming out like Black Panther. You're getting to see them in the forefront in feature films. You didn't really get to see that much in the past, like back 20 years ago.
Given the poor track records for representing people of color in comic book story worlds, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised at this impoverished paucity when it comes to actually seeing Latinx characters and superheroes, supervillains in mainstream comics, DC and Marvel in particular. But we should be more than scratching our heads. We should be upset. Indeed, if creators of superhero comic book story worlds do as they do to extrapolate, distill, then reconstruct from the building blocks that make up reality, then Latinos should be abundant. Yet we are not. We're 18+% of the US population, but we're barely a blip on the mainstream comic book story world radar. And within this demographic, we are Spanish speakers, Spanish and English speakers, and of Cuban, Mexican, Dominican, Puerto Rican, Central American, and South American descent. This is to say, in addition to being the majority minority in the US, Latinxes are also very varied in their experience and identities. Latino-ness or Latinidad varies from each subgroup that makes up the Latinx whole. The comic book universe is only just beginning to clue into this, and this after decades of being blind to Latinos as a whole in the United States.
One of my favorites actually was a New Mutant, my favorite New Mutant, Sunspot, Roberto DaCosta, who I would probably argue is one of the most powerful superheroes in the Marvel Universe. I would still argue that. His power actually comes from the sun.
They ended up kind of elevating his power set after some, Cable involvement and mutant time travel nonsense, but he went from having like this kind of super strength and invulnerability to kind of being able to fly and kind of project his plasma powers out into the world and stuff. So I always liked Bobby DaCosta.
To Sunspot, he was a character I grew up on in the 80s that I never really saw a whole lot happen with. And there's a particular type of whitewashing that is happening with the character now that's been happening over the course of the last few years. And because he's a character that kind of slides under the radar, the only people that I see debating this or discussing this or challenging this are actually the Black and Latino community. Now, I'm not saying that it is necessarily true, but I see the argument actually coming mostly from our side of the table.
I think that comics were still kind of, for lack of a better term, they were still fun and exciting, and at the same time, kind of grounded in the social issues of the day. A lot of people like to think that early comics were just kind of like happy, brightly colored, simplistic. But I remember very distinctly that there's old issues of Spider-Man, Captain America, the Avengers that dealt with very mature themes of racism, of bigotry, and also the nature of conflict.
Another favorite of mine was actually a Spider-Man villain named Tarantula. And he was one of my favorite Spider-Man villains. He wasn't in not a whole lot of issues he appeared in, only a few. And he was a contender with Spider-Man. So he could do a lot of the same things that Spider-Man could do. And he held his own, but he was a Latino character. Amazing, amazing story, but it was a very short story. The Brand Corporation actually altered his genetics, and he became a full tarantula. This happened in the storyline in a later issue. He was fighting Spider-Man, and as he was fighting Spider-Man, a lot of the battle, Tarantula actually becomes, instead of a human, he actually becomes a full tarantula that is fighting Spider-Man. And he doesn't even realize, and once the big reveal happens, you see him looking at himself as we're looking at him too. It was great storytelling, but it was a really scary moment for me. I remember, I was like, oh my God, I've never seen anything like this happen in comics. So he's fighting Spider-Man, and by the end of the comic, he actually commits suicide by jumping off of a building into a hail of gunfire by the police. It was sad for me as well, because this was a villain that I actually enjoyed. There's a character that I actually enjoyed, but I also saw him as a victim. And there was no coming back from that.
Latinx heroes for me that have rekindled my love for comics too and for reading them was the cast from Love and Rockets. Mostly Maggie, Jessica Rio. I feel like I see a lot of myself in her too. And reading those comics too really inspired me to like get back into the game and to see myself like creating characters that are gonna like represent like young Black and brown girls.
Around 87, 88, around the second or third year of Love and Rockets, I discovered that series by Gilbert and Jaime Hernandez. And that brought me back to comics for a number of reasons, not the least of which is they were around my age, a little bit older, and they were representing a world of kind of punk rock and magical realism and stuff that was and had been important to me in my teenage years and early adulthood. But also they represented a kind of possibilities for comics going forward. And obviously their characters were not superheroes in the conventional sense, but they were for me, especially the early run of Jaime Hernandez's Hoppers.
I remember there was unfortunately, a very minor character in, I believe it was either Spider-Man or Moon Knight in the late 70s, early 80s, named White Tiger, who was a Latino man who had this magic amulet, and he was a kind of a street fighter brawler type. It was interesting because it's like, there's a character who is Latino, but I never actually saw him get quite the amount of coverage as, say, a lot of the mainstream heroes.
Now that I think it backwards, I think that, for example, what I liked of Spider-Man or X-Men is the topics about racial issues that they tried to touch, and in some way feel related with them, or class issues that Superman or Batman didn't touch at all. So I'm more a Marvel guy anyway, but we were raised by US comics. But at the same time, at least in Chile, you are raised to hate America as an empire, invader, etc. So it's like a love-hate relation,
I remember Storm of the X-Men. There were some other ones, but I didn't necessarily always buy because there was like not a lot of comic book places either to get them, so I wasn't really sure where to get them. And the older years, when I got 19 years and stuff, I knew where to find them. But I still was looking for characters that were not sidekicks, were not the side story, who were not as powerful as, they were never like as powerful as Superman or Wonder Woman. They're still superheroes, but they were not as great. And they always had some of the lamest costumes too. The costumes were always like these weird off colors. I'm like, they didn't even say super. They were just like, those colors don't even go together.
I always thought it was a little odd that, especially for Marvel, that when they had, I remember there was one of the characters they had was named Black Goliath. And now when you look back, it's like, couldn't they have just called him Goliath? It's like, why did they have to say, oh, but he's Black Goliath? It's like, yeah, you can tell that already.
Communities need to see themselves in the media they consume, because if the only representation that we get comes from some other sources, like we're kind of like destined to imitate and reproduce those same stereotypes,
I consider the reading of comics or viewing comic book films or animation involves our active co-creation of the story world. Each of the respective comic book media explored in print, film, animation, and TV uses different shaping devices to guide how we gap fill a character, event, a plot, the story world globally in and around Latinx characters and superheroes. We see with DC and Marvel, and then we see in the independent scene how different creator teams realize their story worlds with their own respective narrative shaping devices. panels with in-print comics, lighting and lensing with film, in ways that invite readers and audiences to imagine with and beyond what's in front of them. The careful use of geometric shaping devices in the making of two-dimensional static imprint comics can and do lead readers to experience a kinetic movement between panels and within panels. The careful use of auditory shaping devices in film and animation and TV can infuse a sense of the superheroic even before a character acts omnipotently.
I think that we made some serious strides with African-American characters and LGBTQ characters. But I have to admit, and this is something that John Leguizamo spoke about, that there still is a detriment. There's not enough representations of people of Latin descent anywhere, and not just superheroes, but just anywhere. If you don't have enough representations that are like a spectrum of representations, then the stereotype becomes the norm. It becomes normalized. So for instance, if you look at like a character like Al Bundy, who I adore, or like Archie Bunker from All in the Family, they're very kind of beautifully deplorable characters. But you couldn't have a character like that all the time. Like for instance, but you had to have like a Father Knows Best character where you have like this really straight up, like, really great dad, which is a construction, right? Because no one's perfect. But when you see one like a spectrum, you can actually humanize a certain section of people. And we haven't had a chance to do that because stereotypes actually fix information. That's what stereos means. It means hard or fixed, like literally. So it's about fixing that idea. And so if you want to crack inside of that and spread out the spectrum of experiences. So I think it's very important to actually have, Latinx villains and, Latinx everything, because that shows the breadth of human experience.
There's always like the Latin lover stereotype, or like the Latina is always very sexy and and very extremely feminine. I've always kind of struggled with that because like my cousins, even my mom, they're very feminine all the time. They have long, very nice hair. They wear tight clothing, and me, I'm kind of like I cut my hair. I can't stand having my hair long. I wear my brother's clothes, So just to have that, it's something I've always struggled with, like because I identify as female. I like girly stuff. I like cute stuff. So it's kind of like a lot of times I feel like I'm not female enough.
I cling to people like Nichelle Nichols when I saw her on Star Trek. I was like, wow, she's like someone I can relate to, because the people on TV, I'm like, I don't know anyone like this. I was afraid, if I believed everything I saw on TV, I'd be scared of myself. That, out there in the real world, this is how the real world is. And I was like, I don't want to say it's not. And I cling to characters that weren't the stereotypes you would see in like the blaxploitation movies and things like that.
I think that right now, mainstream media is definitely pursuing it a little more. I mean, today I see a lot more Latino and Latina based, animations and movies happening, far more than I did when I was growing up as a kid. I hardly saw anything coming out of, Hollywood or, mainstream media in general. Right now we have, 2 Dia de los Muertos cartoons. We had the Book of Life, and then now we're having Coco, from Pixar. And I think that's great.
When it came time to name my book, I named it La Mano del Destino, which is the Hand of Destiny. Could have called it the Hand of Destiny to make sure that there was no, that it was clear with an American audience, right? I could have done the terrible Latinized an American word, right? I could have called it El Revenjo, right? Something like that, to make it a little more palatable. But I deliberately called it La Mano del Destino, because the story is not only about the character La Mano del Destino, but it is about the literal hand of destiny within the life of La Mano del Destino. So it was important to me that it have that kind of double meaning, and also that it be a cultural flag that I could fly to see who salutes, right? There should be some small barrier to entry. If you can't get past the part where it's got a Spanish title, then it's probably not for you.
I've always thought about representation and how can I represent making more characters of Latin descent? And I have a lot more research that I need to do in order to represent correctly. So I just finished up my first graphic novel, a full-length graphic novel, and it's about a Latino boy who, in short, is probably considered the first Black Lives Matters based graphic novel.
So where I think it needs to go, we need more people just making stuff from their own experiences, especially more, Latinx community. So we need more of that, just being creators, taking their own visions of fantasy that come from their own perspectives. Again, Robert Rodriguez is one of those guys that is doing that, still doing that, and was doing that, and that's why I'm a fan of him, because it's so inspirational.
Oh, the future it's limitless. It's limitless. I can't even begin to imagine. It just seems incredible. I'm pretty stoked. I'm pretty happy with it all.
Everybody deserves kind of a comic book of their own. But if you have to make $3 million profit that quarter, you're gonna shift and bring back someone from the dead and you're gonna go back to the same old formula. So I would just say trust the process, trust your creators, and eventually when no one is looking, something will come along that sticks. And you can't massage success into being, so stop trying. Just trust your creators.
Conversations with younger selves or younger kids that really get impressed when they see a person of color behind a table with comics in front of them, and they ask you did you make all of these things? Did you write, and and just telling them yeah, you can do it too.
So I think Miss Marvel is a good example. The editor for that book was a female, and the editor is Muslim, and then the writer was a woman. The guy was a dude. The illustrator was a dude, but he was also an illustrator of color. So I think they got it right on that hero, and I think that's what just in general needs to happen. That steps to unfold. To get an honest story about somebody that's underrepresented, you need to hire the people that know it best.
The most exciting thing about right now is knowing that there are not just superheroes, but there are memoirs and histories and fantasies and science fiction that are being written for everyone. That was unimaginable for me in the world of comics I grew up in. I loved comics, but I was always disappointed by their limitations. And to see them now able to bring in children and readers, and particularly when I walk in the comic stores today, I see young people and people of color and women coming into comic book shops. That was the world of comic book shops in the early 70s when they started out was not a diverse world at all. Even in a exceedingly diverse city like New York. They were often the whitest spaces around and the most male spaces around. And so walking into a comic book shop today is it's still, even now, even after I've been in this world now, returned to comics for the better part of 30 years, it's still exciting and kind of makes me wish I had kind of been there as it was all happening.
No matter the storytelling format, those Latinx superhero comic book story worlds created with a high degree of a will to style, both in content and form, take me by the hand and guide me into a labyrinthine world of novelty, where with every step their artful reconstructions show me something new about what it means to be Latinx within the order of the labyrinth. I remain optimistic because the great creators of Latinx superhero comic book story worlds educate anew my senses. They make me an active and attentive co-creator. They allow me to soar up, and away.